Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this UACES special event about the new book by Johannes de Berlaymont, the new edition 2024 of Working for the EU, How to Get In. My name is Paul Adamson. I'm one of the patrons of the UACES, have been for so long now, I can't remember when I first started. But I'm delighted to be with all you today and to conduct this discussion. Just to tell you the order of business, I'm going to briefly introduce the book, briefly introduce the author. I'm not quite sure how to refer to him, but he'll tell me in a second. We'll have a conversation, and then in short order, we'll open up the discussion to all of you. There are many of you registered, so this is very much a discussion where you are part of the event, not just me monopolizing the discussion. Let me quickly talk to you about what the book's all about. As I said just now, it's a new edition after the first edition 6 years ago. I'm told it is essential reading for anybody who wants to work in the institution, the EU public administration. Fully updated now, this edition, to take account of major developments such as the new 2024 format of EPSO competitions, the increased availability of internal competitions, and important trends in the types of jobs and career pathways available. The author, the book cover is Johannes de Berlaymont, but I think we have to out him finally. It's a bit like J.K. Rowling and Robert Galbraith. We all know that Robert Galbraith is J.K. Rowling, and I think by now we all know that Johannes de Berlaymont is Martin Westlake, who is a visiting professor in practice at the LSE European Institute, has spent over 4 decades studying European integration and working in European Union government politics. Having completed the first degree in philosophy, politics and economics at University College, Oxford, he went on to take a master's degree at St. Johns Hopkins University School Advanced International Studies, Bologna Centre, and a PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. Since beginning his professional life as a clerk to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, he has worked in the EU's Council of Ministers, the European Commission, with the European Parliament, and since 2003 at the European Economic and Social Committee, where he served as Secretary General from 2008 to 2013. He has published widely on the European institutions and on European and British politics. He is also the author of a major political biography of Neil Kinnock called Kinnock, the Biography. He has occupied a number of visiting positions, and from 2000 to 2005 was a visiting professor at the College of Europe Bruges, teaching a seminar on the European Parliament. Since 2013, he has been a visiting professor at the college, running a research seminar on constitutional, institutional and political reform in the EU. In 2019-2020, he was David Davis of Llandinum Research Fellow in the LSE's Department of International Relations, where he ran an innovative seminar series bringing together practitioners from the European institutions and theoreticians from the Department of International Relations under the umbrella title of the European Union's new foreign policy. And at the European Institute, he co-chairs and co-organizes, together with visiting professor in practice Anthony Teasdale, the European Union in Practice, Politics and Power in the Brussels Systems seminar series. Now, if there's time left for the seminar after that lengthy introduction, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker and very good friend, Johannes de Berlaymont, otherwise known as Martin Westlake, to introduce his book and give us a flavour of what it's all about. Over to you, Martin.
Many thanks, Paul, for that kind introduction. And many thanks to UACES. Like you, Paul, you've been a patron for longer than you can remember. I've been a member for longer than I can remember. But it's always great fun to be at UACES events. I missed Trento this year because our daughter got married on the same date, but otherwise I'm a faithful attender. I suppose, in a sense, I should begin by answering 2 questions implicit in your introduction. The first is, why did I write this book? And the second is, why Johannes de Berlaymont? And the answer to both questions is, it's a similar answer, if I can put it like that. As you said in your introduction, between 2008 and 2013, I had the privilege of serving as Secretary General of the European Economic and Social Committee. And I have this conceit, without wishing to be too pompous, because I'm a sort of an academic manqué. Wherever I've been and wherever I've worked, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, I've always tried to write about my experience as well, or write about the institution in which I have served. And I noticed that there had been no textbook about the European Economic and Social Committee when I joined it in 2003, nor when I became Secretary General in 2008. So when I stood down, when I retired in 2013, I asked my good friend, the publisher, John Harper, if he would be prepared to publish a textbook about the European Economic and Social Committee. And John said, because he's a kind soul, he said, Martin, I cannot refuse you your request, but you know as well as I do that it won't be a bestseller. So I would like you to write a book for me in return, which will be about how you get into the institutions. So in 2016, the textbook came out, Martin Westlake there, The House of European Organized Civil Society. And in 2018, Working for the EU, How to Get In came out, the first edition. Now, I used the pen name Johannes de Berlaymont. I quite like pen names, by the way, but I used it because I didn't want it to be on my academic publications list. I'm less snooty about these things nowadays, but still, it wasn't an academic piece of work. It was a practical guide to how to get in. And the ghost of John Harper's past came and visited me in about 2022 and said, Martin, it's time to write an update. And so hence the new edition, the second edition published in August, which really is as up to date as it is possible to be at the moment, because there haven't really been any developments since the book was published. Johannes de Berlaymont, by the way, the Berlaymont part is unobvious. I even designed a logo for Johannes de Berlaymont, and I have alas at the moment a website that I'm not, a sort of a blog site that I'm not keeping active. But there is Johannes de Berlaymont, and some of you might actually spot that that is the shape of the Berlaymont building. So what does this book do? It tries to provide somebody who might be interested in working for the European Union, but doesn't know very much about it. It's trying to provide for them an introductory guide. At the same time, though, it's trying to provide a more detailed guide to those who already know something, a little, or maybe a lot, about getting into the European Union, but nevertheless not enough. And so there you have a sort of a summary version of the table of contents. I'm not sure whether you can see my slides. That's quite a small font. But I try and explain what is the European Union and what it does, because it does lots of different things, which is one of the reasons why it's so attractive to work for it. I try to provide an explanation of what it's like to work for it. I explain the origins of the European Union civil service and the different forms of the European civil service. I describe the different jobs that are available in the EU civil service and in the institutions. I explain how permanent officials are recruited and employed. I give some detail on where EU civil servants work, and I will come back to this in a later slide. And then I give a great deal of anarchy detail about temporary staff, the temporary agents and contract agents, and the other categories of temporary staff. This is not intended to be read unless one is having trouble sleeping. It's not intended to be read necessarily as a chapter in its own right, but it's the sort of detail which can be extremely important when the moment comes when somebody in human resources in one of the institutions is offering you a contract of one sort or another. So it tries to explain the different sorts of contract and the advantages and the disadvantages of each. It then talks about getting to Brussels. Again, I will come back, Brussels in inverted commas, of course, Brussels, the capital of Europe, how to get a traineeship. I then become a little bit more personalized in talking about narratives and networks, the all-important networks which work in Brussels, as I'm sure they work in Paris or Washington or wherever, any capital city. I provide a metaphor which is like climbing Mount Everest. Getting into the European Union, getting into an institution is not something you can do with a simple interview and then you get offered the job. As probably everybody knows, it takes much longer than that. I then go on to describe the classic European Personnel Selection Office open competition model. I then give detail about internal competitions, which are increasingly prevalent in the institutions, and other ways of actually getting in. And then the book ends with a few words about trends and future prospects. So who, you might ask, is this book for?
Can I interrupt you, by the way, Marta? Are you going to go through your slides one by one, or this is your way of presenting the slides? Because we've got people dialing in saying, are we going to get the slide one by one, or how are you going to progress this?
I thought I'd do slides one by one. I've got one,
perfect.
Two,
okay.
Three.
Just to reassure the audience that they're going to get to the slides. Okay, fine. Answer all the questions.
Oh, yeah. And everybody can have my slides. No problem. I've only got a few more slides to go, actually, Paul, to be honest. So who is this book for? Actually, if I'm being honest, it's written for people like me before I got lucky and went to university and discovered the world of international relations and the world of European integration. And I do, again, without wishing to sound too pompous, there is a sort of moral side, or that's perhaps too strong a term, but I really do believe in the sort of the American concept of representative bureaucracy. I mean, it's not just America, Canada, New Zealand, all of these countries with advanced ideas of what a state bureaucracy should be in terms of its representativeness. Because at the end of the day, we civil servants, or former civil servant in my case, we are working for the people out there. And therefore, the concept argues that it is important that everybody out there should be represented in the bureaucracy. And I don't think anybody would disagree if I said that at the moment, our EU bureaucracy and the institutions' bureaucracies are not very representative. They're the equivalent of WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, I suppose. They're not very representative in terms of ethnic or class origin, and there are various good reasons for that. But if you wish to have a representative bureaucracy, then you need to somehow overcome those reasons, those barriers. And writing a book like this is one way of doing that. So in a sense, again, it's a sort of democratization of the process almost, because it enables people, as I said at the beginning, who have a general interest or a vague interest but don't know too much. It enables them to get a better understanding of what it is to work for the EU. And I should add, why it's a good idea to work for the EU, why it's a brilliant thing, actually, in my opinion, to get a job in the EU. So it's a way of leveling the playing field vis-a-vis the insider. Now, by the insider, I mean people, if I can give an anecdotal example. When I was starting as an official, I was sitting in the locker room after a squash match, and the guy alongside me said, "That's it, I'm in the fast stream again." And I had no idea what he was talking about. What was the fast stream? Well, it's a concept which has been invented by civil servants themselves about how rapidly one gets promoted. Now, the reason he knew about this was because his father had been an EU civil servant. He had gone to the European school. He'd gone to the College of Europe. He'd done a stage. He was an insider. So this book is a way of trying to right the balance in a sense. The book is also important because, as I realized when I was writing the second edition, there have been a series of massive changes to the European Union. First of all, a proliferation of institutions. When I joined in the 1980s, there were 4 institutions and 1 advisory body. There are now 7 institutions and 2 advisory bodies. There has been a process. We don't have a good word in English, but the French have an excellent word, agencification. I don't know whether we can say that in the English language, but we now have 6 executive agencies, 37 decentralized agencies, in which about 13,000 people work, by the way. And there are all sorts of other bodies out there evolving. Joint undertakings is one of them, but other bodies like political party foundations and so on. There's also been a proliferation in terms of the variation in job types, temporary agents, contractual agents, intérimaires, detached national experts, and so on. And all of this detail is explained, or given and explained in the book. There's also been an evolution of working practices, a very positive evolution from my point of view. The institutions are much more user-friendly now. In particular, they're much more family-friendly in terms of when meetings get organized, when meetings are held, but also things since COVID, for example, like working from home. There's also been a great deal of decentralization. I've mentioned the decentralized agencies, which are in most of the member states, not yet all of them. There's also the European External Action Service, which simply didn't exist in the 1980s when I started, and which has 145 and counting delegations throughout the world. There's also, I'd argue, a greater osmosis between institutions and the wider world. This used to be frowned upon. One used to hear about revolving doors a lot. One still does to a certain extent, although now the process is very carefully regulated. But in that sense, Brussels has become increasingly like Washington, DC. And the book also explains the cumulative difficulties that EPSO has had with the generalist open competition model. Despite its best endeavors and its best intentions, and a lot of very devoted people working very hard to try and develop an open competition model which is robust, which is accessible to all, which is safe, well, it's been a never-ending story. So the main messages of the book, and then I'm going to stop with my slides, Paul. One of my main messages is get to Brussels. As I said, Brussels is like Washington. But if you are an outsider, if I can put it like that in inverted commas, getting to Brussels is a way really of leveling the playing field, because you are then in the bubble. You can then build your networks. You are then able to access information in a way that is impossible if you are living somewhere else in the European Union. A second message, which I've already mentioned, is really you should try it and see. The European Union institutions and bureaucracy is probably not for everybody, but I suspect a lot of people who might have hesitations would find themselves reassured if they were able to try working in the institutions in one form or another. A third main message is to maximize your chances and your options. Don't only try the open competition model when it becomes available again. I mean, the generalist open competition. There are other ways, and these are explained in the book. In particular, if you are inside the institutions as a temporary agent already, you are then eligible to sit open competitions, internal competitions, sorry. And just very recently, the European Commission has published a notice of an internal competition for no less than 150 positions, which is open to temporary agents already working in the institutions. Similarly, if you're thinking of, you want to do a traineeship, don't only think of what's called the Blue Book or the European Commission traineeship. All of the institutions and the advisory bodies, and also the agencies and the decentralized agencies, by the way, offer traineeships. Why not apply to more than one? Why not apply to them all? Why not maximize your chances and your options? Another message is be philosophical. You have to be stoical about particularly the open competition, but in particular because there are two phases really to the recruitment process. One is getting onto a list, and the other is getting off of the list and into a job. Both are difficult processes. Last but not least, I would argue strongly that if you're thinking about it, you should try it. You should go for it. On Saturday, at very long last, I saw the musical Hamilton in London, finally. And there is a great song in it, sung by the Aaron Burr character. And the words are, "I want to be in the room where it happens." I would argue, not hubristically, but I would argue increasingly, where it happens is one of the rooms in Brussels, whether it's the European Council or the Parliament or the European Commission. On Friday, I was in the LSE for my seminar together with Anthony Teasdale, and several students asked me, one student in particular, actually, Camille, asked me, are the golden days of the European Union not behind it? And in a sense, it's a good question. I mean, things like economic and monetary union, German unification, the three big waves of enlargement, all the treaty changes, they have been and gone. But nevertheless, I can see that history is still going to be made by the European Union in the very near future. And I think it will continue to be like that because it is a constantly evolving entity. Things like further enlargements, new competences, whether it's health at one end or defense and security at the other, or the Hamilton moment of common debt. So my advice to you all is, obviously, my publisher would demand nothing less of me. Have a look at the book. You won't regret it, especially if you would like to get into the European Union or one of its institutions. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Martin. We're now going to have a chat, but just remind our audience, if you have questions or even just comments, please feed them into the chat function. I'll do my level best to make sure they are taken care of. I got so many questions, Martin, I'm not quite sure where to start. First of all, comment, you say you're far too modest. I didn't realize you were quite so modest person, but you say it's not an academic book, but it's extremely well researched, extremely well documented. So you don't just make wild assertions. It's a extremely thorough book as far as I can see. I'd also say, and I'll come back to that, some examples in a moment, one of the best bits of the books are the bits that you haven't written yourself. In other words, the copious quotes you insert throughout the book from real people who are living the life that you're talking about, which I thought were very revealing, and you're to be commended by not sort of cherry picking those that may be saying things in a certain direction to prove a point. There's a wide cross section of opinion expressed in those quotes from the people you've interviewed in the preparation research for your book. Where do I start? I think, is there a distinction to be drawn, Martin, between, yes, the attraction of working for the institution in terms of policy and the substance and the content, and we can have a separate discussion about how much the EU has changed over the decades and the new things it's getting its teeth into, which weren't even dreamt of not that long ago, on the one hand. And on the other hand, to be very basic and prosaic, is just have the institution as an employer. You know, it's HR expertise. I ask the question because you hear it's extremely difficult, obviously, to get into the institutions. It's getting more and more competitive, as one would have us believe. But once inside, to what extent, in your experience, and both as an insider, as you say, but also in the research for your book, do the people you speak to feel that their careers were being nurtured and being nourished and being promoted, as well as just looking after their dossiers?
Thank you very much, Paul, and for your kind words about the anonymous witnesses, as it were, to the. I thought that was important because, as you said, I didn't want to give the impression that everything is wonderful and that there are no potential problems for particular people or in particular areas. There are specificities about a career in the European Union institutions, as I'm sure there are, by the way, in other international organizations. In the UN, I haven't seen a book like this written about the UN, but I know one should be written because, knowing from friends who work in the UN, it can also be very opaque at times, and there definitely are networks and insider information and so on. So to come to your question, I think the first thing to say is I think that the European institutions have got immeasurably better at looking after their employees. there was a time not so very long ago when you really were left to yourself, and sink or swim, basically. And I think the implicit understanding was that you were an intelligent thing because you'd managed to get into the institutions, or a particular institution, and therefore it was beholden upon you to find your way around, to understand what your job entailed, to inform yourself about all the various aspects of being an employee in the institutions. I well remember my own experience when I joined the council, and I asked a sort of a basic question to do with council working party practices. And my immediate superior pulled a face and said, "Has nobody told you that yet?" God, well, then I'll have to tell you. So,
yeah.
Nowadays, the institutions do things much better. You are told, you are inducted, you go to residential courses. You are given so many possibilities to better yourself, whether it's language courses or various other sorts of courses. So the institutions do all of that much better. I think it's also fair to say that they value their employees more, especially good employees. The last thing you want to do is lose somebody who's bright and brilliant to another institution or another part of the same institution. You try and keep them. I think that's also a phenomenon that's grown in importance. On the other hand, it has to be said that the European Union institutions, as far as I understand it, perhaps it's slightly different with the smaller institutions or the advisory bodies. Obviously, if you're the Economic and Social Committee, for example, with just 700 employees in total, then speaking from my personal experience, you get to know pretty much all of your employees, which is not the case, obviously, in an institution like the Commission with 33,000 and counting employees. But I think, as a general rule, it is fair to say that you have to look after yourself still. It's not like the Foreign Common and Development Office in the UK, where somebody is looking after your career and telling you where to go and what to do next. No, it doesn't work like that. To a certain extent, to a large extent, you are your own master or mistress. And in a sense, that's a good thing, because one of the huge advantages of working in the European Union is just how porous the institutions are and how many different sorts of jobs there are available. Obviously, for you to decide if you wish to move, but it's very easy to move around in a way that it's not, I don't think, in national civil services.
Right. I know it has been in the past an issue about geographical distribution of posts at more senior level, but there's also a trickle-down effect, obviously, for the people to whom your book is addressed, young people applying to get into institutions at an earlier age and earlier stage in their career. But in broad terms, are the institutions as a representation of member states? First of all, we'll talk about other things in a second. Is that quite a good balance these days, or are there still quite striking discrepancies?
Sorry, Paul, I'm not sure.
Between member states in terms of, I'm not sure to what extent there's a hard and fast rule, but obviously member states expect a big chunk of their own compatriots to be citizens to be represented in the institutions.
Well, they expected, and indeed it's a principle established in the staff regulations, that there should be geographical balance, which is another way of putting the same thing. Some member states are better than others at making sure that they do look after their people. I know, for example, that the German permanent representation in the German government is very good at that, making sure that people on the list, for example, know where positions are available, where they ought to apply. Not every permanent representation does that. And the book does explain, as you know, it explains why it is a good idea to get in contact with your permanent representation if you are on the list, and not just to expect the European institutions to come and approach you and things like that. All of that said, I think the Commission has at long last, over the past several years, realized that these imbalances are structural. And coming back to the concept of representative bureaucracy, they are unhealthy. And so it has identified a number of nationalities, or not nationalities, of officials of certain national origins who are gravely underrepresented and who their representation needs to be boosted in the institutions in terms of employment numbers. And so it has adopted action plans for all of those member states, which sort of stand alongside the action plans that the member states themselves are supposed to adopt in the same context. But I mean, there are some, again, this is explained with quotations from real people, as it were. There are structural cultural issues, like, for example, the fact that the Swedes quite like Stockholm in a way that they don't like Brussels. The dangling spouse, as it were, finds it hard to get a similar job in Stockholm. So I know several Swedish officials who go back pretty much every weekend to their wife or their husband because they prefer, these sort of structural problems. You're never going to be able to overcome them, I don't think. At the other end of the extreme, as you know, in the case of the UK, and now it doesn't matter because the UK has left, but the UK never really paid attention to that aspect of the European community as it then was when it joined in the 1970s. And therefore it was always running, although it was hidden because the British officials tended to end up in top jobs, but it was always running a deficit almost. So that, again, coming back to this concept of representative democracy, there simply weren't enough Brits in the administration.
Pushing for their own compatriots to be in the institutions. I mean, how will that work in practice? Young people are watching us now talk, and they're thinking about applying or have applied, but they haven't gone through all the stages yet. I mean, how on earth would somebody know that they should call some embassy or call post? What is the question to be asked? Who do they contact? Even if they reach somebody who's relatively receptive to their position and who's in charge nominally of pushing their own compatriots into institutions, how do they then go about making their case? So could you explain some of all that, please?
Yeah, well, first of all of the perm reps are very good at responding directly to general emails. They all have a general email address, and they will direct your email to the person who should respond. The second thing is that they, I think without exception, I can say they all adhere to the principles of good administration. The European Union itself has a code of good administrative conduct. Similarly, the perm reps do reply if you write. It's not that it will just disappear into a vacuum. They will reply, they will forward your message. The third thing is that starting at the perm rep is maybe the wrong way around to go. Perhaps the better way to go around, and this is explained in the book, is if you're in a member state to write to the European Commission office in the member state, and they will definitely put you in touch with the people who will then look after you. So I hope that answers your question. Obviously, the European Commission has one office or more in all of the member states, and they definitely will help you.
Right. And still on the issue of career path, how good a job now are the institutions doing in promoting women in senior positions of authority? The reputation, as you know, of the institutions, at least historically, was that women were more often not passed over for promotion. To what extent has that improved in recent years?
Enormously is the answer. Enormously. To great effect in most of the institutions. It's an irony that the second von der Leyen Commission has less female members than the first one, but Ursula von der Leyen herself, as her predecessor, but particularly I think Jose Manuel Barroso, we should give a shout out to him because he attached a lot of importance to getting women into top positions. And indeed, he appointed the first female Secretary General of the European Commission. On the principle of it, he really did feel that it should go to a woman. So they're all doing immeasurably better, both in the sense that if it's pick and choose between two equal candidates and in a particular service, women are underrepresented, 9 times out of 10, the woman will probably be preferred over the male candidate. but also indirectly. If I can give an anecdote. Back in my days in DG Education and Culture, the Director General flew back in from Washington on a Friday afternoon, and he said, I'm come with important developments which I need to talk to you about. We'll meet at 8 this evening. This was a Friday evening. Now, I actually said, you can't do that. I said, imagine if you've got a family back home. I mean, I said, obviously, if you the presumption is that the wife back home will look after the family. You just cannot do that anymore. And the institutions, they don't do that anymore. They try and make sure that, you know, there are these plages horaires in which meetings should be held precisely in order not to penalize people, whether it's women or men for that matter, who have young families back home. And in a third sense, I suppose, if you add into that also working from home, which has facilitated things for people who have young families. It doesn't mean they work less, by the way. On the whole, it means that they work more, but they have much more independence and liberty in the way that they structure their work.
Well, one more question on representation, and I promise we'll move on. Which may be some more delicate or sensitive, ethnic minorities, the representation of, frankly, of people of colour in the institutions. Again, the reputation of the Commission and the Parliament is that it's quite a white institution, to put it quite bluntly. How do you respond to that?
Yes, it is. And indeed, as I said in my introductory remarks, it's sort of a version of WASP. White, Caucasian, Protestant. The problem is that the staff regulations don't allow the institutions to discriminate.
All right.
Now, I know it sounds perverse, but
you mean in a positive way?
Yes, there are good reasons for that. I found it very frustrating, for example, when I was Secretary General of the European Economic and Social Committee. It has a wonderfully refurbished building in the Rue Belliard, which has been specifically redesigned with access for people with physical handicaps of one sort or another, so that they can access every single part of the building. And the Economic and Social Committee has a number of members who represent people with physical handicaps and also people with physical handicaps, whether blind, wheelchairs, whatever it might be. And so it would have been great, and I would have really loved to have been able to recruit some people who also had those sorts of handicaps, but it was impossible to do. Indeed, the only way you can do it is at the level of stagiaires, and not because, it's because when you fill in your form as a stagiaire, somewhere it will ask you whether you have a handicap of some sort so that they can cater for you. But you cannot discriminate positively as an institution. A disability, sorry, I've been not handicapped, I've been corrected quite correctly, a disability of some sort. So what is the answer? I believe that the institutions collectively at some stage have to sit down together and think things through. The example I always gave when I was giving communication talks was the 3 squares around the European Union institutions. So you have Place Luxembourg, where pretty much everybody there knows all about the institutions in the European Union. You have, and it's full of EU officials, basically, and various other people working for the institutions. You have Place Jourdan, which is becoming steadily yappified, or whatever the version of that is for the EU officials. But still, at one end, there's the Fritkopf, where you can buy your cone of chips and sit down at Bernard and drink so there's still a degree of. Now, if you were to talk to a Belgian in Chez Bernard, I'm not sure that they would know that much about the institutions or about policies. The third square, though, which is just a few meters further away, is Place Saint-Josse, which is the poorest commune in the country with the highest immigrant quota. And if you were to ask, and yet the people in the square, they would know nothing about the institutions. They're cheek by jowl with the institutions and the administrations, and yet they know nothing about them. And yet they are also EU citizens. So it comes back to what I was saying about representative bureaucracy. At some stage, I believe, I don't have any sort of inside information, but I believe at some stage they will collectively sit down and realize that they've got to deal with this issue in one way or another. And the most obvious way of dealing with it, which is the way that the Canadian civil service, for example, deals with it, or the British civil service, or the New Zealand civil service, is to positively discriminate. So, and the Australian civil service as well, by the way, so that you do have people who represent the Maori or whoever it may be, or the original ethnic population in Canada, for example, so that they are also represented in the administrations.
You said earlier that the EU is becoming a much more family-friendly employer, and you mentioned specifically working from home. I would push back a bit on that. It's not unique to the EU, of course, but you hear many stories and reactions from an employer's point of view in national civil services, in the private sector as well, any large organization, that working from home is fine if you like that kind of thing, but a case has to be repeatedly made for its continuation, because some people would say that it's more difficult to be productive, more difficult to be organized, more difficult to be collaborative if you're working from home too much. And how, so my question to you, make it more EU specific, how good a job in your experience, or the best of your knowledge, is the EU at managing, which is quite a complex thing, I do appreciate, this balance between working from home and turning up at the office?
It's a very good question. Johannes talks about this as well. Because obviously, if you want to get on, or if you're a contractual agent or a temporary agent and you want to get in, then you need to be building your networks. Now, it's much more difficult to do that if you're sitting at home with a computer, rather than sitting in an office and being visible to your employers and to your colleagues. And frankly, a balance has to be found. I think now the institutions are much more relaxed about Monday mornings and Friday afternoons, for example. There is, I forget what it is, I think it's 3 days a week or 2 days a week that you've got to be in the office. But I think, cynically speaking, if you'd prefer to work in the in-house, as it were, rather than at home, it might be in your interest to do so if visibility is an issue at any particular moment. On the other hand, if you're working on policy dossiers and you're good at your job, then you will be recognized whether you're sitting at home or sitting in your office, because the quality of your work will be recognized and rewarded, I think.
Towards the end, before we finish off, I'd like to talk about, yes, the future of the EU, and by definition, therefore, the future of careers in the EU institutions. But before we get there, I'm going to ask a quick question, and I'm going to break off, because I did say I would not monopolize you and invite people to ask questions. There are already some questions in the chat. So sort of end of part one, as it were. Tell me whether this analysis is very accurate, correct. More needs to be explained to people joining institutions in order to avoid, in order to manage expectations, to avoid disappointment. A big chunk of the work of an official in institutions is managing things, managing projects, managing allocation of funds, all that kind of stuff. Not everybody working for the EU is drafting policy and pushing legislation or big picture policy initiatives through the institution. It is, I'm not saying it's humdrum, heaven forbid, but the EU has become quite a large beast now in terms of managing existing projects, common agricultural policy, the cohesion funds, all those kind of things, and other projects. There's a myriad of projects you know far more about than I do. Do you think that when people apply, first of all, is that a correct analysis? And linked to that, when people apply to work for the EU, and people, once they're inside the EU, do they really appreciate that many of these people will spend most, if not all, of their careers doing that kind of managerial work, which, by the way, I hasten to add, is extremely important, even if sometimes it is a bit tedious?
Well, yes, my answer comes in several parts, Paul. It's true that, and Johannes writes about that in the book, that many jobs have become routine. if you're an accountant working on the accounts of a program, there's not much difference between that and working as an accountant in one of the main consultancies here in Brussels, except probably that your conditions of work and your environment are better. So there are more routine jobs. Second answer is that there has been more specialization. And that is why if you go to the EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office website, you will see that there are frequently open competitions published for specialists of one sort or another. Now, they are people, to answer your question, who go in with their eyes open. If you apply to be a nuclear scientist somewhere in DG Research, you might in due course want to change your career and move to somewhere else, and you can do that. But you would not legitimately be upset because you were only working on nuclear issues or managing nuclear programs or nuclear scientists or whatever it might be. The third thing is there's management and management. If you're talking about management in the sense of hierarchical positions and managing other people and money, then that's for people who have the ambition and the drive and the determination and are willing to sacrifice themselves in various ways to work their way up the hierarchical ladder into positions of responsibility. But there are other forms of managerial responsibility which are actually quite enjoyable. If you're working on higher education exchange programs, for example, and you're working with universities and you're managing relations and money with universities, well, that's nice, actually. That's very nice. You're working with the end user in a sense.
Yeah.
And last but not least, a lot of those routine functions, the whole idea of the 2004 reforms was basically to offload those managerial functions to the executive agencies and to a certain extent to the decentralized agencies. And indeed, the origin of the contract agent as a separate type of official was to provide for an official who would be more likely to deal with those sorts of management policy, program management functions than the, let's say, the more policy-driven officials working in the Commission itself.
Well, let's pursue this point by my reading out a question from the chat that you can respond to as well. We touched on part of it, but I think maybe not all of it. Richard Friedman, the senior official in the European Parliament, I think, he says, what is specific then about working for the EU? Some jobs, as you were saying yourself, Martin, HR, human resources, finance, IT, buildings management, others quite different, writing, law, communication, 24 languages, contributing to trilogues, etc. So with all that said, what is special about the EU as an employer? Great question, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and greetings. I would answer in pedestrian fashion first by saying that there is a first chapter in the book, So Do You Want to Work for the European Union, which explains and repeats in key points what working for the European Union means. It's not like working for a member state government because it's still an evolving entity. But in various other ways, it can feel, even if you're working in a fairly routine part of the organization, it can feel special because you are working on aspects like regional integration, you are working for a cause. The EU is a model for other parts of the world, and it feels like that at times. It's an economic and commercial force. If you're working on trade, then you really do feel your power, especially if you go to places like Geneva and negotiate on behalf of the European Union. It's a community of values set out in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. So it's special. It's, if I can put it without wishing to sound either pompous or hubristic, it's a force for good in the world. It's the way it came into being, and it's still the way it is felt as being. It consciously tries to do good in the world and set itself up as a model maybe for the integration process in other parts of the world.
Right.
Will that do you, Richard?
You can always put something in the chat if he's not happy with the answer. There's a question also from Mathieu, and I hope you have a last name, Mathieu. Hi, Mathieu. What kind of advantage does the College of Europe provide? What advice can you give to get in? Well, you've taught there for years, Martin. So what advice can you give about the College of Europe?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Matthew. Well, frankly speaking, studying at the College of Europe gives you a massive advantage in two senses. First of all, I don't know whether you're there at the moment, but the college has created and recruited a careers advisory position currently occupied by an Italian lady, Elena Turci, who is doing a brilliant job. And her role is to provide the sort of careers advice which is summed up in Johannes's book, but by bringing in speakers constantly, so that you are being informed about things like writing CVs, how to get a stage, and so on. So that is a massive advantage. But arguably, the main advantage of the College of Europe is that you will now, for life, be a member of a network, which is by far the most important network when it comes to employment in the European institutions. There are others, the LSE, for example, the European University Institute, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, KUL in Belgium as well. There are a number of other educational institutions which also have a very prominent, if I can put it like this, networking function, which remains live once you leave the college or whatever institution it is. It is, for example, once you leave Bruges for Brussels and you will go Pluxing, which is Place Luxembourg, on a Thursday evening, it's very easy to meet up with a network of Bruges students who will help you to find a place to stay, who will help you to find a position probably in an NGO or a consultancy or something whilst you're looking for that fabled job in the institutions, whether it's being a parliamentary assistant or whatever it may be. So I don't have any recent statistics, but I do quote statistics from about 10, 15 years ago, which show that by far the most efficient network in terms of those who turn up on the lists of laureats in European Personnel Selection Office lists is the College of Europe.
You're right. I'm not speaking from personal experience, but since you keep talking about Place Luxembourg, Martin, my advice also to Mathieu is trying to find a balanced routine, getting people to help you before they've had too much to drink, or maybe easier after they've had too much to drink and they're feeling more generous in terms of job tips and accommodation. But that's trial and error, Mathieu, as I'm sure you realize. A question from Marine Bardou. Marine Bardou. What are your thoughts about applying to work for EU institutions after doing a PhD about the EU? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage? How is it perceived by officials already there? Should you also start with an internship in that case? Martin.
Great question. Well, I'm living proof that it's not a disadvantage, having got a PhD. And in fact, I did my traineeship, my stage in the Commission during my PhD. So I sort of was a bit messy, if I can put it like that. What I advise people, what Johannes advises people when he's giving these sorts of talks, is it's best to do these things in order, because you want to get to Brussels. So if you're doing if you do a master's and then get to Brussels and do a stage, that puts you in the right place at the right time. Or if you do a PhD and then you come to Brussels, that puts you in the right place at the right time. But you don't have to do it that way around. There are plenty of people who have succeeded in the institutions by doing it the other way around. Then, of course, it depends where you're doing your PhD and what the subject is. If you're doing a PhD which in any way is related to the European institutions, then you won't be doing yourself any harm by developing knowledge which a future employer might look kindly upon. And if or contrarily, if you've done a PhD in rocket science or mathematics or something like that, there's a place for you in the institutions as well, certainly in the Commission in DG Research, which is always looking for scientists, for fresh blood in the scientific domain. So my answer, honestly, is it will never penalize you, because apart from anything else, a potential employer, when they see that you've got a PhD, they will know that you are capable, that you are able of indulging is the wrong word, of a sustained piece of research, a high degree of excellence, of drafting a body of work. These are great achievements, and they show something about the quality of your offer to the institution. So I wouldn't worry too much about whether how can I put it, throwing away your chances by choosing between a PhD and the institutions. No, you can do both. And I'm living proof you can do it. Go for it.
Question, thank you, from Bals Kazian. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. What advice would you give to a student who loves the EU, and international relations and European studies, that wants to work for the EU, or what should he focus on? I think you touched on that just now by saying even the EU has space even for rocket scientists. But I think Bals wants to know, are there little tips about maybe where the employer wants certain skills and certain expertise? I suppose that's what you're getting at, Bals.
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to what I was saying about the European Personnel Selection Office, or EPSO, and specialized competitions. It's, well, by the way, I should have said this in my initial presentation. It's well worth your while going to two websites, the website of the Commission and the website of the European Personnel Selection Office, to see what they write about working for the institutions and how you get in. EPSO has done a remarkable job of trying to make itself as user-friendly as possible, as accessible as possible. And one of the things that it explains on its website is the choice that you can make between being more specialized and therefore sitting specialized open competitions, which, by the way, don't prevent you from taking a generalist job afterwards, or being more generalist. Now, you don't need a PhD in rocket science to understand that if you opt for the generalist approach, there are going to be more of you. If you opt for the specialist approach, there are going to be less possibilities. But as I say, once you're in, you can move around. You can move around. Nothing obliges you to stay, for example, in DG Research as a rocket scientist. You can. I know a number of brilliant careers where people started off as translators, for example, and then moved across to policy areas and then enjoy brilliant careers. So have a look at the book, and if that doesn't convince you, have a look. Well, you should be looking at the websites of the institutions anyway. A lot of very, how can I put it, highly motivated people have spent a lot of time trying to answer all of your questions and to address all of your doubts.
Right. Maybe a question which interests you and I, Martin, given where we were born, both of us, from William Daniel. Could you reflect a bit more on ways for UK students, and presumably other nationalities as well, but the best ways to get involved with the EU professionally now post-Brexit?
Yeah, well, as Paul, as you are a living example, one of the ironies of the Brexit process is that the Brits are very well represented in the world of advocacy of consultancies. I don't know why that is. It's always been the case, and it still is the case, by the way. So there's nothing to stop you from coming and working in Brussels. Similarly, you can work in NGOs that are working with the EU. You can work for consultancies that are working for the EU. In various ways, you can be working quite closely with the EU. Indeed, in some cases, you can actually still, although it's theoretically impossible, you can be working within the institutions in their buildings as a non-national, because you happen to be working for a consultancy that provides a service for the institutions. So that's the first part of my question. The second part is that the Belgian authorities, after an initial period of panic immediately after Brexit, have now become extremely generous about granting Belgian citizenship to foreign nationals because they've realized that there aren't that many of them at the end of the day, but those that are applying all tend to be highly qualified and are a good addition, if I can put it like that, to the population. So I myself, for example, I have Belgian citizenship, not because my wife is Belgian, although she is, but because I was able to prove that I'd been economically active in the country for 5 years. Now, that sounds like a long time, but it goes very fast. So if you want to work in the European Union institutions, and if you're prepared to be economically active and live consecutively in Belgium for 5 years, you could then become a Belgian national, and you could then apply for work in the institutions. And I know several people who've already done this, by the way, so it is possible to do. Another way is obviously the marriage route, and that applies to third nationals, by the way, not just from the former EU member states, but third nationals throughout the world. If you marry, as it were, into the EU, then you can, in due course, have EU citizenship and therefore work for the institutions. Indeed, I had a brilliant Colombian lady working for me. I mean, she was Belgian by adoption, but she was Colombian by origin in the European Economic and Social Committee. And I had a Congolese lady, a brilliant Congolese lady, also working for me. Again, the same route, had become naturalized Belgian citizens and therefore were eligible for EU employment.
Right. Richard Friedman adds to our collective knowledge by telling us it is possible for third country nationals, non-EU, to work as assistants to MEPs, members of the European Parliament. MEPs are free to choose their assistants, EU nationals or not. Thank you for that piece of information, Richard. Another question from H.M. Wolodsko. I'm sure I mispronounced. Forgive me, sir or madam. Does the EU have offices or opportunities to work outside of Brussels? And what about working in the UK? Maybe that's a good cue, Martin, to talk a bit about what you talk about quite a lot in the book about EU agencies outside Brussels in member states, not just the information offices, but the agencies.
Yeah, well, there are two different types of working outside. Well, first of all, there's working outside the capitals. So working outside Brussels, Luxembourg, and Frankfurt, let's say, and Strasbourg, to the extent that there are people working for the Ombudsman and the Parliament in Strasbourg. So there are representations in the member states, both the Commission and the Parliament have representations in the member states. So it is possible to go and work in those representations. However, you won't be able to work there forever. You go there for some time and then you come back to the capital, to Brussels or to Luxembourg or whatever. There are then the decentralized agencies. Now these, as I said, 27 of them or more, I think they're growing all the time in number. They work in various places throughout the European Union, and mainly, they don't employ officials. They do employ some officials, mainly in managerial capacities, but they also employ a lot of temporary agents and a lot of contractual agents. And it is possible to spend your whole life, as it were, your working life as a temporary agent in one of these agencies. I know Dubliners, for example, who've worked for the European Training Foundation and have never, sorry, I'm mixing up my agencies now, have worked for Eurofund in Ireland and have never they've set foot in Brussels, but they spend most of their time in Ireland, and their family have grown up and lived all their lives in Ireland. Similarly, I was thinking of the European Training Foundation in Turin in Italy. I was mixing up my agencies. So these possibilities exist as well. And then, of course, there's working outside the European Union. And the most obvious way of doing that is to work in the European External Action Service, or to an extent for the Commission, and to work in one of the representations of the European Union, in one of these 147 representations, or embassies as they now are, to give them their correct term, embassies throughout the world. And there, again, you have a tour of duty, and then you're expected either to go to another representation, another embassy, or to come back to Brussels. But still, the opportunity is there for those who are, if I can put it a little facetiously, footloose and fancy-free, the opportunity is there to go and see the world, go and work in Washington or New York or Nairobi or Jakarta. And there's a lot of important work being carried out by these delegations. So I hope that answers your question.
Back to us now, briefly, Martin. You mentioned earlier the 2004 reforms. Not all of us may be familiar with the 2004 reforms, and trying to show off my knowledge, and it kind of weaves in part of your CV as the biographer of Neil Kinnock. Many people on the call, maybe people not on the call, but don't know this, that Lord Kinnock, Neil Kinnock, was in his second term as commissioner, as vice president in charge of internal reform, staff reform. You'll tell me what his precise title was. What job was he tasked to do, and what was the backdrop to that, and how, that was 1999 from memory, so 15 years later more reforms come, no, 5 years later more reforms. What is the backdrop to all these staff reforms that you've been talking about, and to what extent have they addressed and solved some of the issues that clearly needed to be addressed?
Thank you, Paul. So Neil Kinnock's appointment as Vice President for Reform carried under President Romano Prodi the Jacques Santer Commission, which had become embroiled in a sort of a scandal which was about much less in the end than it seemed to be at the beginning. But in one aspect in particular, there was good reason for a reform process to be undertaken. And that was that the Commission had steadily enlarged its executive functions in terms of managing programs, but without any clear idea about how that should be done. So managing people and money, basically. And so the ensemble, the package that the Kinnock reforms represented was, on the one hand, the professionalization of the civil service. Now, I mean the managerial level of the civil service in particular, to give it the managerial ability to deal with such managerial functions as something that was a given rather than something that might be learnt occasionally or somebody might have. So now you can't be a manager unless you've got a degree of professional training. It's as simple as that. A second element, though, was what I mentioned again in my introductory remarks, which is this process of agencification. Instead of farming things out willy-nilly to technical assistance offices or whatever they might have been in Luxembourg, which was one of the elements that was involved in the Santer Commission's problems, now there is this concept, heavily regulated, represented in the staff regulations as well, of the executive agency, and that is where this work is done, or in the decentralized agency. So we now have something that does that work rather than inventing things creatively or every 5 minutes whenever we get a new responsibility. Because as you'll recall, Paul, from those golden days of the Delors heyday, the Commission was rapidly assuming fresh responsibilities, but it didn't really have the capacity to deal with them, certainly not to deal with them in a professional manner, an appropriate professional manner. So agencification, the creation of specialized agencies to deal with those functions. And the third aspect was financial, that in order to avoid any sort of risk of there being some sort of corruption, you introduced standard accounting functions as they would be recognized, I suspect, in most of the private sector. And in particular, things like, I remember from my own days having to go through the mill of learning all of this, the principle of 4 eyes. So there was no one person who signed off money. It had to be at least 2. And then there was an internal, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there was a DG audit. So it was supposed to audit everything. The auditing function was internalized to each DG so that, there was a much higher level of professionalization and of sophistication in the institution's management of those functions. Maybe I should stop there because otherwise I'll become Anaraki.
Well, it's my fault for mentioning Neil Kinnock since you are his official biographer. Just tell your audience, we're coming quite close to the end now. They're in the home stretch. So if you want to ask a question of Martin, it's now or never, at least for this, as long as this afternoon is concerned. So looking forward then, we've done quite a lot of bit of looking back. That the EU is clearly embarking on loads of new policy initiatives. Some it sort itself because it's quite ambitious as an institution. I tend to think of the European Commission, obviously by extension, other institutions latch onto that as well, and partially because events, make it more key to coordinated action at EU level, even if that is often controversial. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, the response to COVID, the recovery fund, the big issue of migration. Now everybody's talking about defence and procurement in the defence sector, and so on and so on and so on. How, in broad terms, Martin, do you think, to what extent is the EU, in broad terms, tasked with and equipped for dealing with these new challenges, both in terms of its internal procedures, if you like, which is obviously a broad key theme of your book, but also in terms of the politics and member states accepting that in some areas the EU as a centralizing force has the ultimate, if you like, power to do things, or to what extent do you think member states are also trying to pull back the Commission from wielding too much power? A very big question to finish off with.
Yeah, no, I think my answer again comes in several parts. The first is that the institutions, as perhaps you would expect, given how difficult it is to get in, they're full of very clever people who are positively motivated. They've joined because they want to, I'm putting things in simple terms, they've joined because they want to build Europe. They don't want to block Europe, they want to build Europe. And so there is a vast well of talent available to face up to fresh challenges, as we saw with the COVID challenge in 2020. I mean, we must forget there are institutions like the European Parliament whose whole raison d'etre is predicated on the physical presence of their members. And within pretty much a month or two, they had turned themselves into an absentee parliament because they had to. Yeah. Now, that was a brilliant achievement. I'm sure, I know actually there are articles about it. Hussein Kassim and other worthy academics have written about this. Well, the Commission, within a period of 2 weeks, it had to send everybody home, but with computers so that they could work online from home. You know, all of these were major challenges, and they faced up, and the council as well. I shouldn't leave out the council. Mm-hmm. They faced up to these challenges brilliantly. The capacity is there to face up to challenges, the current challenges and new ones. That's the first point. The second is that how can I put it? The institutions have their own roles and their own procedures, and these are highly sophisticated. But again, the guiding principle of them all is to reach consensus in order to be able to move forward. That there's no delegation. I mention this because, you know, the Hungarian presidency has been doing good work as well. There's no delegation that sets out to block things. There's no delegation in the council that sets out to block things. In the parliament, they might want to amend things, but the momentum is all forward. It's all constructive. And that indeed, I would argue, is one of the pleasures of working in the European Union, because you are genuinely building things all the time. So to come to your challenges, I think the EU will always find a way of facing up to them, because the desire is there, certainly the capacity is there, And the institutions, to the extent that they have to adapt, they will adapt. They will find a way of adapting in order to be able to drive the process forward.
Right. Well, on that confident note, I think we should draw this to a close. I'd like to thank all of you who registered and have been listening for the past hour and 20 minutes or so. Thank you, especially those who asked questions. I'd like to thank UACES for organizing everything. You get behind the scenes there. We know you know who you are. Thank you so much. And last but not least, our guest, Martin Westlake, Johannes de Berlaymont, and all of you should think about acquiring, buying, or at least purloining a copy of his book. It's a very good read indeed. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Martin. Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
See you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.